Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer 40k lore, where today we are going to talk about boarding actions. Yes, indeed. It is a tactic that only a relative handful of factions within the 41st millennium are capable of carrying out effectively, because, as it turns out, it is actually rather difficult to get a large quantity of armed and capable fighting men over to an enemy spaceship that's traveling at hundreds of meters per second, not to mention, bristling with defensive weaponry, etc. It is not for the faint of heart, and that is also why so relatively few factions engage in boarding actions on the regular, or use it as a reliable tool in their naval warfare arsenal. With perhaps the most immediate standout example of this being, of course, the Space Marines. Of both the loyalist and heretical variety, although they go about it slightly differently. Today, we're gonna go through how all the factions do boarding actions, because, I'm feeling ambitious today. I may regret this later. Let's begin then with the Imperium of Man, and rather than starting with the Space Marines, which would be a little bit too normal for my taste, let's ask ourselves, do the Imperial Guard, or more correctly the Imperial Navy, engage in boarding actions? Well, yes and no. The most common sort of boarding action that the Imperial Guard, or again, more correctly, the Imperial Navy is going to be engaged in, is defensive boarding action. This does require a little bit of specialized training and equipment, and of course Imperial Navy vessels are designed to make boarding actions very, very difficult, with long, narrow corridors often overlooked by automated or sentry weaponry, or simply by naval armsmen with shot cannons, or heavy weapon emplacements nearby so they can set them up in a hurry if required. But we're not really going to delve too deeply into the defensive aspect of it, we're just going to touch upon it lightly here and there. As for offensive boarding actions, the Imperial Guard is neither trained nor really equipped to carry it out, as using various types of weaponry aboard a ship can be a very, very, very bad idea. Like, rocket launchers, flamethrowers, flamethrowers in particular. Listen, you don't want to fire a flamethrower within a confined space, because what's going to kill you isn't the flame or the heat, it's the fact that there'll be no more oxygen left. A bit of a problem. Explosive weaponry too has a tendency to be amplified somewhat in confined quarters. The Imperial Navy as well do not really engage in offensive boarding actions, but there are elements of the Tempestus Scions, the stormtroopers, that could at the very least carry out commando actions aboard enemy vessels. Again, this would require some extenuating circumstances, or a situation where boarding the enemy vessel is likely to be uncontested, where they will use Valkyries or other void-hardened transports to get themselves from their own ship and to the enemy ship. Obviously, trying to board a vessel mid-fight in a Valkyrie is begging for death, so again, extenuating circumstances. But theoretically, if anyone in the Imperial Guard was going to do it, it would be the stormtroopers. But enough with the hors d'oeuvres, let's get into the meat of it, the Space Marines. Because of course, whereas the Imperial Navy will simply, blow the enemy to bits with massive ships or wave upon wave of attack craft, the Space Marines have a little bit of a harder time of it when it comes to naval engagements. First and foremost because, whilst their ships like the battle barge and strike cruisers are serious pieces of hardware, they don't have that many of them. Many chapters also maintain fleets operated by bondsmen or servants, with lighter ships like sword classes, for example, or even on occasion heavier things like light cruisers, although this is very, very rare. But by and large, a chapter is going to have to rely on maybe 2 or 3, often less, or maybe even just 1 battle barge, and a handful of strike cruisers. If they're very, 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 very lucky, they might have something like the Imperial Fists, like an actual mobile star fort, but this is beyond rare. So the total naval power of a Space Marine chapter tends to be very limited. And so the Space Marines must simply do more with less. Which incidentally, is pretty much their job description to begin with, so I imagine they don't mind over much. And of course, there are very few things that are doing more with lesser than destroying an entire kilometers-long warship with 12 dudes. And that is, of course, also where the actual point of boarding actions come into play. Because, in reality, boarding ships is goddamn difficult and exceptionally risky, and only really done if there is a huge price at the end of the effort. And again, destroying a massive enemy vessel, or potentially capturing it with just a handful of soldiers, well, that is that tremendous reward. And as I talked about years ago with why is there melee in 40k, it is all about maximizing your own advantage. All of those problems that the Imperial Guard might have in a boarding action, like, explosives in confined quarters, or flamethrowers, etc., or all of the enemy's kill corridors and sentry-served weaponry, going on, well, most of these things aren't really an issue for a Space Marine. A flamer? He's got a fully integrated breather system in his helmet. He doesn't care if all the oxygen is gone. High explosives? He's protected by like 5 centimeters of ceramide, plus shock absorbers. He doesn't care if the frag grenade is a little bit louder than normal. Honestly, the crew-served heavy weapons is probably the only actual issue. And even then, as we have seen in multiple instances through novels, etc., when Space Marines run into heavy weaponry at the other end of the corridor, they simply either shoot it, as they are way better shots than the guys on the other end, or they charge it, trusting in the aforementioned 5 centimeters of ceramide armor to stand up to anything the enemy can throw at them. And obviously, once you're within fisticuffs range, anything short of an Ork knob is going to find itself at a severe disadvantage against a Space Marine. Most of the disadvantages and problems inherent in boarding actions, therefore, aren't that big of an issue for the Marines. In fact, a great deal of them, like the closed, cramped, and confined quarters, is actually to their benefit. Especially when you take into consideration that, whilst the Space Marines would probably simply blow up the enemy at range as well, if they had the option to, if you're going to be heavily outnumbered in terms of ships, and thus in turn weaponry, well, having 12 guys destroy the enemy warship is a lot more effective than trying to have your much smaller fleet engage the enemy on their terms. Again, maximization of advantage. The Space Marines do better in a boarding action, and so they're going to board, whereas the enemy is going to be doing everything in their power to avoid it. Let us now also take a slight moment to talk a little bit about the specifics of Space Marine boarding operations, because of course the various chapters that have, so in some cases even specialized in boarding operations, have developed various differing tactics to make sure that they are as effective as they possibly can be. Usually this takes the form in the utilization of specialized weaponry, or more often than not, armor. This in fact harkens back to one of the earliest instances of 40k, Space Hulk of course, where it was precisely Space Marine Terminators that were sent in to deal with the Tyranids. And a suit of tactical dreadnought armor, well, that is about the most specialized piece of boarding hardware in the 41st millennium, as it will allow you to get around the whole crew-served weaponry thing by literally walking towards it whilst pumping out a few hundred bolt rounds a minute. It also, of course, works in close quarters combat, with certain Terminators equipped with storm shields and thunder hammers. The shield itself uses the disruption technology to make itself, well, practically invulnerable, to the point where even if there was a las cannon, an anti-tank weapon, at the other end of the hallway, well, it would create a pretty little light show as it splashes off the shield, but that's about it. Other Terminator weaponry, like assault cannons, are also ideally suited for these kinds of environments, as you simply become the heavy weapon at the other end of the hallway. In fact, there's a specialized doctrine around this, where the Terminator simply plants his feet at the end of a hallway and hoses down anything coming in the other direction. Heavy flamers as well, obviously, do excellent jobs, especially as the Space Marines don't have to care about the previously mentioned problems with flamethrowers. The Storm Bolter 2 is, well, it's just two bolters welded together. It's going to be pretty damn useful. Thunder Hammers and Lightning Claws as well. But, obviously, Terminator armor is pretty dang rare, and only the fewest of chapters have more than a single company's worth. So they're going to have to develop some more clever tactics to get around their limitations. Limitations? Merely having to use power armor to defeat the enemy, and, a fully automatic grenade launcher. Chapters might develop Auspex technology to scan through walls. Many chapters will particularly avoid attacking the enemy head-on, and instead use melter charges to blast their way through bulkheads, thus opening up new paths to the enemy. This isn't a uniquely Space Marine tactic, of course, as anyone can theoretically do it, but Marines have the ability to carry a lot more and move a lot faster. They can also move through the now molten metal hole much more rapidly and with far greater confidence, for the simple reason that they have all of their Auspex hardware in their helmets as well. This is another issue. In many cases, a ship might, for example, turn off the lights. If its armorsmen are equipped with night vision goggles, then fighting in perfect darkness is to their benefit. Again, maximizing advantages. But Space Marines, they have countless visual filters inside of their helmets. They can see in infrared, they can see night vision, they can see your heat signatures, they can see through walls, whatever they need. And some chapters, like the Space Wolves, also make use of their enhanced senses, in their case their noses, to sniff out the enemy, and potentially alternative paths around him. Though, mind you, this is obviously something that the ship itself is going to be doing its darndest to minimize. You're not going to want suspicious, human-sized vents going right behind your defensive position, for example. There was even a special pattern of Imperial cruiser used during the War for Armageddon, I believe. The name escapes me at the moment. I want to say Voss pattern, but I'm not at all sure. Anyways, the cool thing about it was these were Imperial cruisers that had ran into some difficulties in the past and had suffered serious damage. In return, they had gone to the Forge World, Voss, which I believe that was its name, but take it with a pinch of salt, where they underwent rebuild operations. And as a part of this rebuild, the ship was essentially divided into two separate quarters, the forward and the aft part of the ship. In between these two parts was only a single corridor. This meant that if the ship got boarded by the Orks, a species we will get to that are very fond of boarding actions, the crew could actually abandon half of the ship, fall back to the extremely defensive bottleneck, and hold off the boarders there until either, if they held control over the driving part of the ship, drive back home and then get help, or if they were stuck, quote-unquote, in the weapons part of the ship, they could render the vessel, well, non-offensive, so it wouldn't be shooting at any allies or anything, or they could turn it against enemy vessels still in the nearby area, and then wait for friendlies to come and help them. This saved many an Imperial vessel from being overrun. As in reality, boarding warfare is a continuous race between ship designers and the boarders themselves. Or at least it would in any other universe, but this is 40k and technology is kinda stagnant, so if anything, this was a rather unique little innovation that turned out to work incredibly well against the enemy they were currently facing. But this only works so long as you can keep the enemy to one side, as really the biggest part of boarding an enemy ship in terms of tactics and strategy isn't necessarily what you do whilst aboard the ship, but what your objectives are and how you actually get onto the ship in the first place. So let's talk a bit in general now, as these challenges tend to be the same for all of the various factions. First and foremost, it is the delivery system. How are you actually intending to go from one ship to the other. This, incidentally, is one of the main reasons why the Imperial Guard doesn't do boarding actions, because on the one hand, you might think that, throwing a few thousand dudes at a ship and taking it over would be pretty goddamn great. I mean, these ships are massive, right? Just send over an Imperial Guard regiment, you'll take it over, and you'll have a huge new warship. Okay, sure, you'll lose a few guys, but so what? They're expendable chaff, after all. Well, here's the issue. You gotta get them there. And unlike the Space Marines, humans tend to react very poorly to extreme changes in velocity. Like, for example, boarding pods. Space Marines can survive going from several hundred meters per second to 0 upon impact with an enemy ship, and, live. Whereas a human, well, the word strawberry jello comes to mind. And I hope you've installed some sprinklers or high-pressurized hoses inside of the boarding pod to, wash out the remains. Luckily for the Imperium, the vast majority of species in the galaxy have a similar and adverse reaction to sudden deceleration, and so at least it's not just the humans. But you might now be asking, okay, if the going from 200 meters per second to 0 part is the problem, you could just go slower, Well, there are a couple of issues with that. One is the fact that the target, the enemy vessel, is also traveling at several hundred, if not thousands of meters per second. Remember, in space, going fast is very, very, very easy. In fact, it's harder to not go fast than to go fast. And so to actually hit the target, you need to go fast as well, and the slower you're going, the more difficult it will be to make an intercept course with the enemy ship. Plus, of course, the enemy isn't just simply going to let themselves get boarded. And luckily for the ship, and unfortunately for the would-be attackers, most vessels in 40k are already covered in defensive weaponry. Not designed to take down boarding torpedoes or anything like that, but point defenses, intended to shoot down the other major threat against vessels: actual torpedoes, filled with high explosives this time rather than men. And it's a small task indeed to point the massive minigun towards the torpedo filled with dudes and the torpedo filled with high explosives. Similar targets. And again, you have the problem where if you're going slow, you're a sitting duck. These are weapons designed to intercept torpedoes going at maximum speed in an attempt to break through that very point defense. So if you're not going at the very least an equivalent velocity, you're probably in for a very bad day. Now, theoretically, you could, for example, develop specialized weaponry along the lines of cluster munitions weaponry, for example, designed to have the warhead start breaking apart once it enters point defense range and shower the enemy hull with shaped charges or other explosives, with the aim being to destroy point defense systems, which would potentially open up a path for more maneuverable vessels with the ability to decelerate and actually latch onto the enemy ship, like the Valkyries, for example. But that's a lot of efforts to go through, and you're going to need a heck of a lot of Valkyries to bring enough Imperial Guardsmen onto the ship to make a actual job out of it. In fact, this is something that the Elysian Drop Troopers do. In fact, to become a Elysian Drop Trooper, you have to serve with the Imperial Navy's anti-piracy patrols in the Elysian system. They too use Valkyries to board enemy ships, but in those cases, they're attacking either very old and poorly maintained warships of very small sizes, destroyers, stuff like that, frigates maybe, or simply merchant ships that have been up-armored, and then used as privateers. A much, much softer target than an actual line vessel, or even a regular ship of war. To get around these defenses, then, the usual way of doing so is to either utilize the aforementioned boarding torpedo, which is in essence just the torpedo but carrying dudes instead of an actual massive warhead. Or you could use something a bit more specialized, like the Astartes Cestus Assault Ram. This one's a far more dedicated boarding ship, although it can be used for surface assaults as well, although, God help me, I don't know why you would want to. Where the advantage of the Cestus is, of course, that it has an actual pilot, And since it is a spacecraft, it also has weaponry, including missile batteries which it can use to engage enemies trying to shoot it down, allowing the Cestus to, in essence, escort itself. This is another vulnerability of the boarding torpedo, or the Valkyrie for that matter. Enemy space superiority fighters or interceptors are going to have a field day with such small, lightly armed, or in case of the assault torpedo, unarmed vessels. Whereas the Cestus has enough armor and enough weaponry to at least be a prickly target. It can also carry quite a lot of troops, which is deployed via double forward assault ramps after the Cestus has blasted its way through the enemy armor, as the Cestus also sports a forward-firing super-heavy melter weapon known as the Magna Melter, allowing it to quite literally liquidize the armor plating of an enemy ship before ramming into it. The boarding torpedoes have a similar system as well, incidentally, but the Cestus's real strength really is in the fact that it has some teeth and the fact that it can steer itself. One of the problems with boarding torpedoes is that if you miss, well, you now have a long tubular thing filled with incredibly valuable super soldiers just drifting through space, begging for someone or something to shoot it, which is a tremendous waste of the Emperor's elites. There are even some ships that have this as their, well, primary defense, simply getting out of the way of the incoming boarding parties. The Eldar, for example. Eldar ships are very fast and very maneuverable, allowing them to rely on just getting out of the way to prevent getting boarded. Most Eldar ships also have a fairly hefty complement of fighters, in that every Eldar is usually trained as a guardian, so every member of the crew is, in theory at least, capable of offering resistance. Contra an Imperial ship, which might have crews in the hundreds of thousands if not millions, but only a very small percentage of that are actually armsmen. Hell, the majority, the people working down in the Engineerium, or even the gun crew half the time, have no idea what's going on outside. They don't know if they're currently in combat, or if they're doing exercises, or merely on maneuvers, or hell, just driving from one place to another half the time. Only when shit starts clanging off the hull might they begin to form a bit of a suspicion as to what's happening outside. And I suppose that's an excellent opportunity to move on to the next faction, the Eldar. Do the Eldar board things? Yes, they do, although they do so to varying degrees. The Eldar, the actual Eldar, they are not over fond of boarding actions, in that it doesn't really allow them to maximize their advantages. An Eldar fleet is very fast, very maneuverable, and have very good guns, meaning that they probably want to engage in hit-and-run tactics rather than the protracted engagement of a boarding action, because of course, to return to a previous point, what is the objective of a boarding action? Well, it is either to actually capture the ship, in which case you need to subdue resistance and take command of the bridge, or then shut yourself off to the point where you can bring in further reinforcements, or force the crew to surrender. Or alternatively, it is to destroy the ship, in which case all you really need to do is get to the reactor or the main armament chambers, place a few melter charges, and then run as fast as you possibly can out the door. And watch the fireworks. Hopefully. For the Eldar, well, taking over human ships is very, 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 very pointless, frankly. And as for destroying them, again, they'd probably prefer just picking them apart at range. But if they absolutely have to, they would either use teleportation, if possible, or they would probably use some of their grav vehicles as a form of Valkyrie transport rather than any sort of a boarding torpedo to try and overcome the ship. They would probably even prefer, in fact, to cripple the enemy vessel first before making any sort of a boarding action, knocking out engines, weapons, bridge control, and so on, before they go on to actually do whatever it is they're planning to do. But the dark version of the Eldar, the Dark Eldar, the Drukhari, well, they've got an actual reason for taking the vessel. Not because they want the ship, but because they want all of the funny little screamy humans aboard the ship, so that, they can take them home and torture them at their leisure. Now, despite the difference in motif, their tactics would probably be relatively similar to the Eldar, in that they would prefer to pick on a target that is already not going to be posing an active threat to their own ships, preferring obviously civilian vessels or merchantmen, as even though you could be boarding warships, it's a lot of effort for really not that much reward. Preferably you'll find a nice big fat civilian transport loaded up with refugees or something to pick on. Way more dudes with way less risk. But if they've got to take on an enemy warship, again, cripple it, take away its weaponry, and then board it slowly using various grav vehicles or even teleportation. Now, the Dark Eldar are far better suited to actually fighting in boarding actions, however, than the Eldar. The Eldar have people that can do it as well. Striking Scorpions would do fairly well in boarding actions. Dark Reapers can certainly hold a corridor, no doubt about it. And Howling Banshees, well, they've got inbuilt flashbang, so that certainly helps. But they are not quite as specialized as the Dark Eldar. As hell, even their basic weaponry, the Splint Rifle, is a fully automatic shotgun firing venomous shards that shatter and scatter yet further fragmentations on impact. Oh god. That has got to be the most diabolical shipboarding weapon ever. Again, there's a reason why the naval armsmen of the Imperial Guard use shotguns, because shotguns are great in close confined quarters, and this is a venomous shotgun that creates further shotgun pellets upon hitting something. The Dark Eldar too are, of course, if anything, overblessed with close quarters specialists. I imagine witchers would actually find the close confines of a ship to be a rather fun diversion from their usual arenas and more maneuverable styles of warfare. And that's even assuming, of course, the Dark Eldar will be bothered doing the hard work themselves, rather than having one of their homunculi simply flood the enemy vessel with his various tortured experiments with, saw blades for limbs and so on, and wait until the screaming stops. The Dark Eldar would also not shirk from using various other weaponry of more, unconventional natures. Fear and terror, obviously, like, sending broadcasts to the enemy ship with screaming and crying and babies and all kinds of noises like that. Obviously, psychological warfare. They would be more than happy to. Gas attacks as well, because, well, one of the best ways to subdue an enemy vessel that has, of course, by necessity of it being a spaceship, an enclosed atmosphere is to taint that atmosphere. There are certain other factions that might be interested in this, but if you could introduce even just a relatively small quantity of poison into the ship's circulatory system, it's going to take a pretty hefty toll on the people aboard it very quickly. Now, the amount of gas you're going to need is going to depend upon the size of the ship, of course, and obviously the ships themselves are going to have the ability to close off areas, shut off vents, shut off circulatory systems, and so on, but even this is not really a great solution, as of course the people aboard still need air. They still need heat and temperature control, and all of the other niceties you require aboard a warship in the middle of space. Even if you can only infest a relatively small portion of the ship, you could severely hamper the operations of the rest of it. Obviously, this is a more long-term tactic, as you need to actually suffuse the ship and or wait for it to start running out of its own resources and or have the crew be forced into an ever smaller area due to the lack of air and temperature control and so on, but against a civilian ships that might not have all of the fancy fallbacks and security systems of a warship, I imagine gas would probably actually be the best way to take care of it. Simply just fill the areas with some sort of numbing agent, for example, or something that the Drukhari themselves are immune to, and voila! Or good old-fashioned fear gas if you got it. I imagine it would reduce the number of slaves, however, so maybe go with the numbing one instead. And since we are on the topic of dirty tricks, the Space Marines aren't the only ones that can maximize their advantage in boarding actions. There are of course also the Chaos Space Marines. Oh yes indeed, and they might have a certain penchant for dirty trickery. Obviously everything that goes for the actual Space Marines will also go for their Chaos variants. They have armor and weaponry that will give them a tremendous advantage in close range fighting, which means that boarding actions is kind of ideally suited for them. The same will go for their Terminator armor as well, obviously, but the forces of Chaos also have access to a great deal of unconventional weaponry that the Imperium doesn't. For example, teleportation technology is something that we've kind of mentioned here and there, and obviously teleporter tech would be super duper uber useful in boarding actions, as you can get rid of the whole like transporting to the enemy ship thing. You are in most cases going to need to actually get a beacon on the ship first, mind you, because otherwise teleporting somebody onto a moving ship and you don't have a clear view of the internal structure, you're probably going to end up inside of a wall or something, which is hazardous to one's health. But Chaos don't necessarily need to teleport the actual people. They got demons! Now, this too will require, of course, some sort of a rift or weakening of the void or something, but such things can be achieved via esoterical means, in which case you could simply manifest demons aboard the ship as an advanced boarding force, or even as the main boarding force for that matter. Now, admittedly, it is going to require a fair bit of luck, because you are going to need the Imperium and the warp to be on your side, you're going to need a weakening of the whale, and you are going to need a way to keep it weakened throughout the entire engagement, but theoretically, it is absolutely possible. You can also use the warp in other ways. The fear gas, for example. Okay, cute idea, but you're limited by good old-fashioned physics and the need to actually distribute it. Warp nonsense doesn't need that. You could always simply paint the ship with some kind of warp echo, make the souls of the damned literally scream through the corridors. Even a small advanced group of acolytes could set up all manners of unfortunate rituals inside of a ship that might severely weaken its combat potential. Again, you're betting a little bit on having time here, but that's only if you're using something psychological. There are other things that can turn any latent psyker aboard the ship into a screaming warp entity, or simply a hole in reality for that matter. Or you could fill the vessel with some Death Guard poison, or Thousand Sun sorcery, making the ship think that it's, I don't know, suddenly being flooded or whatever. Chaos does what Chaos wants to do, and really, there's no limit but your own heretical, devious creativity when it comes to using the powers of the ruinous gods to mess with the living in boarding actions. And speaking of, obviously a Chaos Space Marine will function more or less similarly to a Loyalist Astartes aboard an enemy ship, with the added fun and games of warp fuckery. But Chaos doesn't give two rats' assholes about their people, which means that even if their tactics will lead to tremendous casualties amongst their acolytes, who cares? So simply swarming the enemy vessels with tiny transports, all with their own melter warheads used to blow a hole in the ship, and then overrunning it with acolytes and cultists, why not? They might even have boarding torpedoes designed for enhanced humans, with just a touch of the warp to them to the point where they can survive the impact. Or they might even simply just dock with the ship and overrun it that way. This is a very, very, very dodgy tactic that is probably going to require the immobilization of the enemy first and foremost, but in theory, so long as you've dealt with its ability to move, and thus in turn its ability to point its main guns at you, there's no reason why you couldn't set up actual straight-up boarding parties, where you could simply move people from one vessel to the other, or shuttle traffic troops over using transport craft. And since Chaos can mobilize a far greater percentage of their manpower than the Imperium can, they'll eventually overrun pretty much any warship. As for the reasons why they would want to do it, well, for once, Chaos's primary reason for boarding a ship is finally to actually take the ship. Like, the Space Marines don't care. Well, if it's a sword class or something, they might give a shit. Or an enemy strike cruiser or battle barge, they might care, but considering who usually operates those, it's probably irreversibly tainted at that point. Even the Imperial Guard is only going to have a mild interest in capturing ships if it is, religiously appropriate to do so and functional. But Chaos doesn't care. If it's a goddamn Eldar ship, they can corrupt that. If it's a human ship, absolutely. Imperial warships, hell, half of their fleet consists of captured warships. They will absolutely want to steal vessels, and the best way to do that is through a boarding action where the purpose is to actually seize control rather than destroy it. This is a risky business, mind you, because of course we haven't mentioned the biggest problem with boarding action, namely that you are going to have to take your dudes, put it on the enemy ship, whilst engaging aforementioned enemy in a gun battle in space. Yeah, that's kind of one of the problems. If you can cripple the enemy vessel, then great, problem solved, but you're not always going to be able to do that. In fact, the boarding action itself might be aimed at crippling the ship first. Because basically, if you can take out its engines, maneuvering thrusters alone will be too slow to allow it to bring its main battery guns to bear in most circumstances, allowing an enemy vessel to make it into synchronous orbit around it and then continue boarding. But this is of course assuming that it is even possible to cripple the enemy ship, which, whilst you're not fighting at your fullest, trying to aim your shots at engines and weapon compartments without destroying the target, it's probably trying to destroy you, meaning you are in a very unfavorable engagement. Mostly this is going to be done by vastly larger or more powerful vessels that reckon they can just suck up the beating, or it'll simply be done as a, hey, if it works, great, if it doesn't, meh, kind of tactic. Again, the benefit of Chaos is that they could absolutely flood it with cultists and still blow the ship up without really caring. This is one of the issues I have with Space Marine boarding actions, incidentally, because far too often they will talk about boarding actions in action with Space Marines aboard the ship whilst their parent ship is still shooting at it. Like, are you sure you want to risk the lives of God only knows how many dozens or hundreds of Space Marines by blasting it to bits? I'm presuming they have some sort of identification beacon, but even that, it's gonna have to be a damnable strong one to keep their position actually tracked across hundreds, thousands of kilometers of space. Even then, stray ordnance, aiming problems, blah 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 blah. It seems like a massive danger to the boarding party, but sometimes you might not have a choice. And hey, even if you do hit the enemy vessel, it doesn't mean you're necessarily going to destroy it, as, kilometer-long warships can take quite a bit of a pounding before they go supernova. But this is, of course, all again assuming that you care about anyone aboard, and there are plenty of factions which, well, don't. Chaos is one of them, but we have yet further still to go. The Orks. Oh god, the Orks. See, up until now we've been talking about why people want to seize warships, whether it be through tactical necessity because you don't have enough guns to kill all of them, or because you want to capture the people aboard, or because you want the ship itself. In the case of the Orks, they board enemy ships because funny. Literally. Funny. There's no deeper reason, there's no real strategic or tactical consideration at hand. They know there are people aboard the ship that might fight back if provoked, and so the Orks go over there. Simple. And they will do so in whatever way they can. Once more, we can pretty much just abandon all of the previous theories and stratagems and equipment and stuff. Specialized assault craft, boarding, torpedoes, teleportation. The Orks have all of these things and more, as anything that can fly and bring an Ork to the enemy vessel is going to be used as some sort of a boarding device at some point or another. I mean, if an Ork pilot decides that he's sick of playing at space warfare, he might simply just ram his spacecraft into the ship and then be a one-man boarding party. Hell, Ork vessels, as in the actual warships, half the time just ram the enemy anyways, hoping to get entangled with them so they can board them with their own greenskins. I mean, they have, boarding torpedoes. They presumably even have assault craft of some sort, but being Orks, Who even knows? What is a boarding torpedo to one Ork mech boy might simply just be an extra large warhead to the next one. But the Orks do have several unique advantages when it comes to boarding actions in that, well, they're pretty much as strong and tough as a space marine. They do lack the armored protection, but they make up for this in sheer unbridled idiocy and not knowing when to simply just stop twitching. This, unsurprisingly, gives them a pretty big advantage in close quarters combat, and then you add in the fact that there are also tens and tens and tens of thousands of them, all of them equally retarded and equally willing to charge screaming towards the enemy's guns at a moment's notice. In fact, they are over-eager to do so. What the Orks lack in specialized materiel, they simply make up for in, well, lack of brain power. And inherent improvisation, I suppose. Though there are undoubtedly some Orks that do specialize in boarding actions, like Ork freebooters, for example, the Ork pirates. They will undoubtedly have figured out some sort of unique tactic, probably unique to the warband, honestly, as codifying Ork strategies is pretty goddamn pointless, frankly. But I'm presuming they too will have figured out things like, okay, you can't rush the hallway, fine, go around and blast open bulkheads. Voila! Things like flashbangs or hand grenades as well, it's going to affect them a hell of a lot less than it is going to squishy humans, or most other things, honestly. Stick bombers are no doubt very, very worthwhile in close quarters engagements. They can also use their flamers without too much fear of depriving themselves, at least lethally so, of oxygen, as they are ridiculously tough. They can also shrug off wounds that would put any mere human down, not to mention the knobs being even bigger again for elite shock troopers. That is, if you can assume that they have some sort of organization, which is probably optimistic, but hey, details. And as mentioned, some of their ships are specially designed for ramming attacks. Now, in some cases, you will ram a warship and it will simply just go boom, because you hit it with something sufficiently larger. But in many cases, whilst it will almost certainly do catastrophic damage to the receiving end's ship hull, it's not at all guaranteed that it's going to destroy it. In fact, it's very unlikely. But the moment it gets tangled up with the Ork warship, of course, it's probably going to be getting some visitors as well. As, well, Orks can actually survive in the extraordinarily limited atmospheric envelope that most of these massive warships attract. And even if they can't, so long as they are reasonably close enough to the target, the Ork can, well, jump. I know, it sounds rather ridiculous, but there are actually instances of Orks simply leaping from one ship to another. Now, granted, the ships are actually touching at that point in time, but even so, sailing through hard vacuum would usually give any living organism at least brief pause, but Orks, enough said, frankly. There are also other creatures that do actually cross through the cold, deep darkness of the void to board other ships, however, without mechanical protection. That is, of course, the Tyranids. Yes, the Tyranids' entire strategy is boarding actions, albeit of a rather unusual sort. Now, the Tyranids have several different forms of weaponry, which is essentially just their babies that they throw at people, that will splash upon the hull in big acid gloops, for example, which can be bad enough in and of itself, but more often than not, a lot of their organisms are burrowers, either making their way into the ship to then detonate as sort of a delayed warhead style thing, or to fill the ship's internals with acids and simply bleed away armor like slag, or invade the ship itself. There are even Tyranid warships that are simply just, well, enormous ramming ships, but rather than the boarding action from the ram, more correctly, being a, bonus, the Tyranids will ram a ship, open its maws just before hitting, and grab a hold of the ship with tentacles and drag it in, and then start puncturing the vessel with, well, pumping tubes filled with angry Tyranid monsters. It really does worry me how much of Tyranid's strategy relies on penetration followed by insemination, but oh well. As for the Tyranids' efficiency in this, well, they're enormous gene-bred monsters. How effective do you think they are? Yes, they're pretty good at it. Hell, even the basic little gaunt thingy, your primary defense against stuff like termagants and hormagaunts is to shoot them at long range with overwhelming firepower, concentrated volleys of lasgun fire, and so on. In the close confines of a ship, well, your fields of fire are going to be severely restricted. And even if you kill the first wave, well, in a tight corridor, you've just created more living little shields, well, previously living shields, for the follow-up waves to push ahead of themselves. Your ship invaded by Tyranids is not long for this world. Pretty much straight up, right there. Its survival chances are more or less over the moment the thing makes contact, as of course a Tyranid hive ship can simply just keep pumping it full of warriors, of gaunts, and whatever else is required. And that's assuming it takes the bother of boarding. Otherwise, it could simply just fill it with acid or pump it full of those fancy little suicide balloons, the spore mines. Just have those go all around the ship and explode all over the place. Not to mention, biological warfare in the form of gas, I imagine, would be something else that the Tyranids would be quite fond of. And considering the sheer size of the delivery mechanism, e.g. the pumping tube can be the size of an actual ship, I imagine their primary problem with poisoning a ship's crew, namely volume, is not really going to be much of an issue for a Tyranid fleet. Or, hell, if we're going to be particularly disturbing, why would the Tyranids board the ship at all? It's not like they're going to bother taking it over. It has no use for it. Would it simply want to detonate vital things like reactors? Sure, but it could probably get rid of the vessel's occupants by a slightly different way. Remember that every single Tyranid vessel is a living organism that devours things. In fact, its only real purpose is to eat entire planets. Alright, well, how do you eat something? You need digestive acids. Yes, indeed. I'm presuming things like bulkheads and stuff would provide a degree of defense against this, of course, but it's just a question of how acidic the the digestive fluids are at the end of the day. Yeah. The Tyranids do also have but individual organisms that can actually fly into the ships as well. Kind of like other races would use fighters or interceptors, etc. The Tyranids simply release entire enormous clouds of spore-like fighter creatures to invade the enemy ships, simply relying on sheer mass to force their way through any point defense systems imaginable. They also have the advantage, of course, of being intelligent. See, that's the scary thing. A lot of the various boarding systems in 40k are flawed because they're not very good at finding a target. Imperial boarding torpedoes need to rely on the same kind of guidance system their regular torpedoes do, which fail all too often. And whilst they're speedy by, space warfare standards, they're still not very maneuverable or intelligent or good at actually locking onto a target, as the machine spirit will obviously try to make course adjustments, but again, it's just not very good at it. And seeing as you can only fire a handful of torpedoes at a time, you kinda gotta make them count. But if you fire simply just 5 billion individual bioorganisms that all home their way into the target individually, whilst being guided by larger synapse creatures flying in amongst the waves, well, even if they miss, so what? They'll simply turn around and flap their stupid little spaceborne wings the other direction until they eventually catch up. There are even examples of Tyranids crippling ships by simply ramming themselves into the ship's engines, until eventually clogging them to the point where the engine's plume is doing more damage to the ship than to the Tyranids. honestly, the Tyranids would probably be the single most effective fleet force in the entirety of 40k. Endless numbers, enormous ships with meters of regrowing organic armor that can release literally limitless quantities of bio-creatures to overwhelm any opposition. Their only real theoretical limitation is how many synapse creatures they can put into the cloud of interceptors, as of course a synapse creature requires a lot more biomass than the little ones. Thank God for that, because if they could actually just launch these clouds at any range and keep them under command, well, what would even be the point of the actual large ships? Whenever they detect an enemy fleet, they would simply just dispatch 5 trillion little ones and wait. Hell, that might indeed actually be what they do half the time. And speaking of factions that just practically downright cheat, really, Necrons. Do the Necrons board things? They do. Do they need to? Not really. Their ships are so hilariously overpowered they can pretty much destroy anything with virtually no effort whatsoever. Honestly, the Necron whole tomb ship thing is one of those little 40k plot points in that they can apparently rip apart entire capital ships in mere moments without the defending vessel even knowing what the hell happened to it. Defending against that is going to be problematic. But even that is really just the tip of the iceberg, as the most dangerous thing the Necrons have is their near-perfect command of teleportation technology. Everybody else has teleporters of varying usefulness and degrees of accuracy. The Imperium's teleporters are very, 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 very rare, and only the largest capital ship is likely to have them. They are relatively accurate, but without a firm layout of what they're teleporting into, and preferably a teleport beacon, accidents most certainly do happen, and rather frequently as well. The Space Marines have better teleporters, but they too are very rare, usually found only on larger vessels, strike cruiser at the very least, probably a battle barge, and the technology is better, but far from perfect. And that pretty much is the calling card for all teleportation tech in 40k. The Orks have teleporters too, teleport us, but well, they don't really care about the casualties it creates, so yeah. To be fair, Tyranids don't have teleporters, so that's something, I do suppose. Whereas the Necrons have incredible teleporters, to the point where they literally outfit every single solitary warrior with a recall teleport beacon. If they want to board something, they don't need to worry about getting on the enemy vessels through some archaic means like a transportation pod or anything. They'll simply just beam their soldiers onto the enemy vessel and call it a day. Hell, they don't even need to worry about such crude things like blasting through bulkheads to outflank enemy defenders. The Wraiths can literally slip through solid matter. So even if the enemy does have the oft-mentioned choke point, the Wraith doesn't really care. He doesn't even need to make a big boom to, blast out behind it. The Wraith will simply slip in behind the weapon team, slit their throats, and then send the signal for the rest of the Necrons to keep marching on. Hell, even if they don't have Wraiths. Do Necrons care about casualties? No, because all of them are teleported back to the mothership anyways. In terms of sheer boarding potency, the Necrons are probably even more so than the Tyranids, because in a boarding fight between Necrons and Tyranids, who would win? Well, probably the Necrons. Honestly, one of the issues with the Necrons is that, considering how good their teleportation technology is, weaponry, frankly, should almost be sort of kind of outdated to them. Why do they even need giant green lightning cannons if they can simply just teleport high explosives whenever they want into an enemy vessel? You want to cripple the ship? Oh, just teleport a large enough bomb into that Engineerium. You want to deal with enemy fighters? Teleport literal Necron warriors into them if you so desire, to simply blast them apart from the inside, or micro-explosives, or God only knows what you want to put in there. But, even the Necrons need to be balanced to some degree. Honestly, it would be very interesting to see a confrontation between a Necron tomb fleet and a full Tyranid hive fleet. In a straight-up boarding match. I imagine the Tyranids would probably have an advantage in that they can probably keep it going longer than the Necrons can. Since once the Tyranids actually eventually manage to Tyranid wave anyways, their way aboard the tomb ship, once they reach the repair bay, the Necron's chrome goose is most assuredly and thoroughly cooked. As for everybody else, well, you'd best just pray. A lot. As the Necron's only real weakness is the fact that there's not a whole lot of them, so theoretically, you could outlast them, or outrun them, or simply try to outgrind them if you've got enough bodies to throw in their way, but it seems like a bit of a long shot, as the defending vessel's best chance is probably going to be to actually destroy the Necron ship before the implacable steel warriors make it all the way to the Engineerium, and then start an inevitable and highly pyrotechnical chain reaction. Leaving us finally with but a single faction to consider, the least likely of all of them to be engaging in any sort of boarding action, the Tau. We are going to leave out the minor factions for this one, as frankly most of the Imperial ones are probably already covered by the other Imperials, the Imperial Guard, but okay, the Tau. Why would the Tau board anything, ever? Why? It's a genuine question, isn't it? All of their ships are going to pretty much be better than anything they find. I imagine that they might have a momentary interest in maybe something like a tomb ship or an Eldar vessel, maybe? In the aims/hopes of reverse engineering something? That's not entirely unreasonable, that they might board something in an effort to figure out exactly what the hell it actually is, and whether or not they can replicate what it is, presuming that they've discovered some aspect of it that they find worthwhile. The Eldar, for example, might have their cloaking device technology, making their ships appear as if they are somewhere else entirely. I can imagine the Tau would probably be quite fond of something like that, seeing as their entire thing is to actually avoid getting murdered. And the first step to avoid getting murdered is to not be where the enemy is shooting, of course. Actually, the more I think about it, that is going to be the justification for why the Tau would ever even consider for a second to board anything, because they're interested in what's on board the ship, and they want to see if they can't make it their thingity-bob. Now, even then, there's only so many things they would bother to board at that point, but they'd probably have a small gathering of Imperial vessels to see if there's anything worthwhile aboard them. The Eldar would definitely be interesting. The Tyranids, well, they're probably going to investigate them to see if they can turn them into, bioweapons or something. Even Orks might have something to offer, although I doubt they'll board many Ork vessels. The idea of a bunch of Pathfinders and Fire Warriors boarding an Ork vessel is, mildly hilarious. Now that's a real forlorn hope right there, but trying to get information? Sure, absolutely. That is a theoretical. As for how they would do it, well, I would imagine mantas and barracudas. The essential ground attack bomber and air superiority fighter, or space superiority fighter anyways, over the Tau. Now, they would probably need to undergo some remodeling to switch out a bunch of the weapons and possibly even the power systems for troop-carrying compartments, but they can absolutely do it. I'm pretty sure they already have some variants of them that can carry troops, so it shouldn't be impossible. Now, as to whether or not the Tau would find it, interesting to do so, that is perhaps a different question. But if the need arises, I have absolutely no doubt that the Tau could come up with a troop transport variant very, very swiftly. and they already have a pretty good chassis in the two aforementioned crafts. They have decent maneuverability, good pilots, and very good weaponry, allowing them to close with the target without being too bothered by interfering space superiority fighters or various projectiles hurtling towards them at great speed. As for what do they do when they are actually aboard the ship, well, they just have to tow it out really hard. In many of the preceding examples, with like Orks and Space Marines, etc., the entire idea in a boarding action is to maximize your own advantage by placing your soldiers in a position where they are going to have a devastating superiority over the enemy, like a Space Marine and melee with a normal human being. But with the Tau, boarding action is the absolute last thing they want, as whenever the enemy actually gives them a field of fire that they can use their superior range in, well, it's gonna be just long enough for the enemy to use their guns effectively, and any additional range the Tau have at that point is kinda pointless. Not to mention, there's not going to be a whole lot of cover for them to make use of either. They're going to have to engage in a lot of very close quarters fighting, and a lot of the Tau weaponry is simply not designed for it. The Fire Warrior's pulse rifles, for example, you do not want to be lugging a weapon the length of a spear around in room-to-room fighting. Even more so if the spear doesn't actually have a spear tip, as the Tau are none too fond of bayonets. Now, they do have some close-quarter weaponry, mostly in the form of knives or wakisashis, essentially, as they are inspired by the weeaboo Japanese, of course, but you really should not be bringing a knife to a spear fight, particularly if the opponent's weapon is both a spear and a fully automatic rifle. The Tau Pathfinder's pulse carbines are better, but even then they're the size of the average Tau's torso. These weapons are not designed for close-in usage. They are designed to be used at long range. Hell, even the Tau's helmets are designed to help ranged combat. They do have some fanciful filters inside of them that could be useful in low-light environments or covered by smoke, for example, but it narrows their field of vision, again, to increase their accuracy at long range, but this is a massive detriment during boarding actions. The Tau are simply rather dreadfully equipped for this on every single solitary level. Honestly, their best bet would be to point the Kroots in the rough direction of the enemy and go, right, we're going to put you aboard that boat. Please take it, and then count the casualties afterwards, as even the Kroots are, well, they're better, much like the pulse carbine is better, but they have no armor, they have less than ideal tactics, and their weaponry too is hardly ideal. You're talking about a long halberd-like thing in cramped, close environments. The Tau, quite frankly, just really suck at boarding actions on every single solitary possible level. Their best bet, and here's the thing, they do suck, and they're probably always going to suck, but physically speaking, the average Tau isn't that inferior to the average human. Maybe 10, 15, 20% tops. They're not completely worthless even in close quarters combat. So all you really need to do is get them the equipment they need to be effective at that range. First and foremost, give up on the whole pulse technology nonsense. I'm sure it's cute when you're in the open field and dealing with enemy heavy infantry, obviously, but at close and personal, you don't need penetration the equivalent of a small tank. What you need is rate of fire in a small, compact, and maneuverable package. They're also going to have to do something about those helmets, and really their entire armor system, and for God's sake, put a knife on whatever weapon you come up with. Really, the Tau's only real strength in boarding actions would probably be their drones, as having the ability to send a little beep boop around the corner before you yourself put your head into the crosshair of whomever is sitting at the other end is obviously very advantageous. Since drones can also be equipped with a wide variety of weaponry, you can also outfit it for room clearing operations, or even just put grenades on it and send it in to dump them in the room. The Tau do have the ability to adapt swiftly to changing circumstances, however, and so if anybody has the opportunity to actually adapt to this situation quickly, it would be the Tau. And the Vespids, I imagine, could actually be halfway decent boarding troops, as, if nothing else, the novel ability to go up and down because of wings would open up some interesting tactical possibilities. Then also a pinch fiercer in close quarters than the little blueberries are. And hey, Bavarian servers' populations do need a little bit of culling every now and then, and herding them into the enemy's guns in close confines might be just the ticket to make sure that those damn little buzzy things don't outbreed the Tau too much. But yes, the Tau, not great in boarding actions. They could probably do fairly well in stealth battle suits, since they would be able to hide from most forms of detection and, carrying around a minigun is certainly going to give you an edge in most firefights, but again, the damn thing is about as large as the Tau carrying it, not to mention the bulky nature of the suit. Maneuvering that around doorways, etc. is going to be challenging at best and good old-fashioned suicidal at worst, if there happens to be a naval armsman with a shotgun pointing at the door on the other side. And with that, I believe we've gone through all of the major factions in 40k, how they view boarding, why they might bother doing it, and how good they might do it as well. We've been a little bit more haphazard than I usually am, as I am unironically sure I could probably make a 15-20 minute video on the boarding strategies and tactics for each faction, but frankly, I imagine I would be repeating myself an awful lot because, well, one of the main features of a boarding action is precisely the fact that the defender will have stacked the deck as much in their favor as humanly possible. And the best way to do that is pretty universal. Give the enemy relatively few areas to approach you, make those few areas relatively tight and awkward to get through, and then put dudes with guns on the other end of it. If anything, boarding defense might be the more interesting topic for each faction, as I imagine that Orks, Tyranids, Imperial Guards, and even Chaos would react to borders slightly differently, even though the general defensive pattern would remain the same. Anywho, before I waffle off on a completely different and unrelated tangent, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Until then, have a good day.